You've decided you're ready to become a parent, and suddenly you're overwhelmed with people who feel they have the right to inform you on the correct way to conceive, give birth, what fears you should have, and the proper way to parent. How do you filter through the opinions? How do you know what's trustworthy information and what's a myth or just plain outdated? Welcome to the Birth Ease podcast. Join your host Michelle Smith and her guests as they cut through the noise and fear by sharing valuable tips, tools, and proven methods that help you connect with your own inner wisdom as you navigate the sacred journey that is pregnancy, birth, and parenthood in a more relaxed and confident manner. This podcast does not constitute, nor is it intended, as medical advice.
In today's episode, I have the honor of interviewing Matt, and he's going to be sharing with us loss from the father's perspective. Because while there's silence around pregnancy and infant loss in general, women tend to be more open about their loss, and dads, maybe they don't feel comfortable sharing about their loss, but sometimes the journey of the father gets forgotten as we discuss pregnancy and infant loss. So welcome, Matt.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for being here. So I was hoping that you might be willing to just share a bit about the loss of your daughter to begin.
Okay. Well, we lost Rowan in 2014. It was a very, very late pregnancy, stillbirth. Completely unexpected. We didn't know there was any kind of complications or any kind of issues at all with the pregnancy. And when she died on June 10th, and she was born on June 12th. An interesting kind of reverse in most people experience with children, having a death date before a birth date. But for us, it was a completely unexpected blow, something we hadn't even really prepared for, you know. It was, like they say, every parent's worst nightmare come true. And it left both of us in a very dark place. But one thing I did find, though, was that there were different expectations of what the parents should express, how they should react to the situation. Of course, we were both, emotionally devastated, but I think just through societal roles and gender norms that exist, I was more expected to soldier on, keep a stiff upper lip, and to, of course, I also had I had my partner who was completely broken and devastated from what had happened to her, and I had a dead child, and I had to help her as much as I possibly could while trying to hold myself together. And it was a very, very difficult place to be in.
I think that's really, profound what you said about parents experiencing a death date before a birthday. I'm kind of at a loss for words because it's so true and it's so profound. And I think those roles for fathers to hold that stiff upper lip and soldier on, even if they're not spoken, they're very much there subconsciously. And so in that, do you feel like that affected your ability to mourn and grieve the loss of your daughter?
Now, one thing in our particular situation was, I think, the difference between the mother and the father was I never got to meet Rowan personally. I mean, through her mother's belly, I was able to interact with her a little bit, but I think my partner had a much more intimate relationship with her than I was able to, because she lived inside of her, because she carried her, for the 9 months that she existed. So I think that's something that in my grieving, that was different, because even though neither one of us got to actually hold her while she was alive, I kind of felt that was robbed of actually experiencing her and meeting her. She got a little bit more. Not that I was angry about that or anything like that, but it seemed that it was even more of a situation of this just isn't fair. So that's one thing that's always kind of stuck with me, is that I never got to meet her. And that's something that's always really resonated with me and always really bothered me about the loss, especially.
Yeah, you had to say hello and goodbye all in the same moments.
Yeah. Watching your child come into this world when you know she's dead is something that is, well, obviously something I wish I never had to see. And, luckily my partner was spared from viewing herself. But amongst the things that might be different between a mother and a father's experience was the fact that I watched that happen. And that's definitely something that's always going to stick with me. It's not something I regret doing, but it's something that, like with the entire situation, is something that you should never have to witness, something you should never have to do.
Right. Yeah, there's no words for it. I do think it is important to hold that child after your child's born, because those are, and that hello and goodbye, those are the only memories really that you have of your baby. And
you have that choice. Some people choose not to. Some people it's too much for them. And, I get that. I mean, the whole situation's, emotional overload. We struggled actually with that ourselves. We weren't sure what we were going to do at the time. We didn't have we had a birth plan. We didn't have a plan for this situation for death. So we were basically being bombarded with, things thoughts that had never crossed our mind before. And, one of those was, did we want to hold her? And a lot of people probably, think that of course you want to. But at the time, it's a very difficult decision. I mean, we chose to, of course, that we, wanted to interact with her and hold her and take pictures and things like that, because like Michelle says, it's a very quick hello and goodbye, because you have a very short window at that point. So I think it's a precious moment that you will probably regret later if you don't get to have it, if you choose not to. But again, it's all your choice. But I believe at first it did, but as time went on, I really kind of discarded worrying about that. I didn't care if I broke down anymore. I didn't think just because, I'm a male that I should be able to deal with this in a more, quote unquote masculine manner. I just accepted my grief for what it was and went from there. And of course, therapy helped with that, and to realize that men hurt the same way women hurt as far as, emotional losses. So to not try to, struggling to find the right words here, not to write it off as, something that happens and something you just need to accept and get over with. That, it is a profound psychological loss and something that you need to work through and accept your emotions about it, and not to keep that stiff upper lip. If that's not what you can do, then don't do it.
Yeah, I agree. And I found that our culture in the States, I don't think we mourn very well. I feel like overall we expect people, if they have a loss, that they're supposed to be done mourning within 24 to 48 hours after the funeral, or to be back to work within 2 weeks. And that's not enough time, even if someone, maybe it was a grandparent and you knew that lived their life, their time here on this planet was over. But when you lose a child, and it's an unexpected loss, people, what word? Now I'm at a loss for words. Like, people don't understand sometimes the devastation that it plays, or they're too afraid of it. Would that be the right word? Afraid of it. They might support you initially, but then
They don't want to take that on themselves. They don't want to have to deal with it if they don't have to. I think is it may not be the nicest way to put it, but I think that's kind of a truth. No, I also think that in this society that we also tend to expect people to mourn rather privately. Mm-hmm. People in general don't want that to encroach on their universe, that they have to deal with the fact that their coworker or their friend or acquaintance or what have you is dealing with something that they don't want to think about themselves. The loss of a parent, loss of a child, those are very awful things that most people don't want to think about. And it seems that the people that have to go through it also have to bear the responsibility of keeping it to themselves for a lot of, for the most part. And again, also like returning to work too. I was expected to return to work like nothing had happened. Oh. My coworkers at the time, acknowledged what had happened, and, I got all the normal platitudes and things like that. But beyond that, I was expected to go back to work as if everything was normal. My productivity should be exactly the same. My personality should be the same. I think that's one thing that people don't tend to think about or take into account, is that a significant loss like that will affect, it changes you. Your personality is not going to be the same. You're not going to be maybe the same happy-go-lucky person you were before, but other personality changes as well. Obviously, you're probably going to be more reserved and less joking, less jovial, outgoing person that you might have been before. And those changes may be permanent. Some people just change permanently after that, and that's to be expected. I don't think that's something that people widely consider, but I do think that is something that does happen, and it does have an impact on people's relationships, because going through a significant loss like that, you find out that a lot of people, your friends, some people, they will start to distance themselves from you. They just don't want to hear it. They don't want to handle it, or they don't know what to do. And their solution is basically just to remove themselves from the situation. I'm not saying that's the correct thing to do, and I'm not saying that's the wrong thing to do, but because sometimes sort of blundering into a situation can do more harm than good. But you do find that people also become uncomfortable around you, just being in the same room with you. Not like this necessarily that the topic is loss or that you're talking about death or anything of that nature, but just in general, they do not like to be around you. And it's visibly, in some cases, obvious. No eye contact, they fidget, make obvious excuses to leave for no reason, things like that. And even, at work, especially with people that are less than friends or just acquaintances and coworkers, that's even more pronounced. You find, people that used to give you a phone call, or people that used to come over to your desk and have a conversation with you about something, it comes down to a 2-word email. If even that, and sometimes even you start to get messages through bosses or other coworkers. It's just abundantly clear that they just do not want to be around you at all. And that's it's mildly hurtful in some cases, to be ostracized like that for something that's completely beyond your control. And if you stop and think about it, it's really something that you shouldn't, whether intentional or not, you should try to be mindful of the fact that this person didn't do this. This isn't an action that they wanted. That you should at least try to make them as comfortable as possible, especially like on the return to work. And while they're going through this, because the process of grief and grieving for a significant loss takes a long time. It's not, like Michelle said, a 2-week bereavement period and you're back to your normal life like nothing happened. It's been years since we lost Rowan, and I still struggle with it. Sometimes, daily, sometimes, I just struggle to even function because grief doesn't really decide, that doesn't give you a warning when it's going to come on. Something can trigger you that you don't even think about. Other times you just dwell on the thoughts.
I think that infant and baby loss, it's just this grief like no other. And there's there's so much silence around it. And I feel like I'm so glad that you said what you said, because it's such a lonely and isolating experience. As I've worked with grieving parents, it's almost like you feel you have the responsibility almost to sometimes to protect people from your grief, because they might be uncomfortable and you don't want to make them uncomfortable. Whereas if people could just ask you, how are you doing? And be okay with your answer. If you said, I'm having a really hard day, or if they said your baby's name. I know people hesitate to bring up your child's name because they don't want to make you sadder, but the sadness is there. And most parents I've found really appreciate it if you'll say their child's name and remember their child for the person that they are.
I agree, especially for those parents who lost their child before birth, because one blow that they get right off the bat is that they don't get a birth certificate for, like in our case, it was a very, late stillbirth. So there's no death certificate, there's no birth certificate, because as far as everything goes, there was no birth, so there was no death. And that is kind of a blow, because it's almost immediately like at the highest level of society that there's no acknowledgement that your child ever existed. So no, I don't think I can only speak for me personally. I don't mind when people use my child's name. And also to that effect, like you said, with people, the parents almost feeling obligated to keep people feeling comfortable around them because of the loss. You tend to not even worry about whether or not they did, because I accept the fact that people won't use her name as well, because I get that. But again, it's just like you said before, it is people, playing to, it's the grieving playing to the non-bereaved. And it seems like it's our responsibility to keep them comfortable, which is an odd situation if you really step back and think about it. But I did a lot of those things in dealing with people. I spent a lot of time with people who would come to pay their respects or saying, for whatever, sorry about your loss, so on and so forth. And they would break down and I'd be the one comforting them. Which I understand is tough for people to think about, and they may have their own personal loss that this is bringing up information on, but it's just kind of a surreal experience when you step back and think about it, that they're offering their condolences and you're the one giving them comfort. It seems like it hurts them more to say the words than it is for you to hear them, even though it isn't. But so I have an anecdote I just thought of, dealing with a coworker, and this is one that is probably my most profound experience in dealing with how somebody reacts to news like that, and how you end up comforting them. So after I've been back to work for maybe 2 or 3 weeks, a coworker that I worked with that doesn't work all the time. She works sporadically, on a need basis based on, business needs. So I hadn't seen her for a while, and she had recently been out on maternity leave. And so the first time I had seen her, she knew that, we were expecting to have a child. And so the first time I saw her, she didn't know anything. Nobody had told her what had happened, which in a kind of one way was kind of a relief that it wasn't like a gossip vine thing that got to her. But in another way, it was also kind of the ultimate foot in the mouth situation for her, because the first words out of her mouth was, "Hey, how's the baby?" And I immediately could tell that she had no idea what had happened. very happy, smiley, bubbly face, genuinely expecting to hear good news. And, you know, when they say, like, you can walk into a room and you can feel when the energy's off, so to speak, you know, you can tell when there's an argument taking place, even if it's silent, or that people are at odds with each other. You can just feel, like, the mood shift in the room. We were in a room with, like, about 3 other people at desks and a couple other people milling about. And just, you know, you could almost, the proverbial needle off the record, just, you know, everybody stopped what they're doing. The typing stopped, everything. And, you know, I told her that, unfortunately, you know, we had lost Rowan, that she passed away. And her first reaction was, don't joke about stuff like that. It's not funny. And I was, you know, like, no, I'm not joking. You know, at this point, I'm trying to hold myself together. It's not a topic I wanted to, you know, speak about that publicly at work, but I found myself in that situation. And then she surveyed the room, and the looks on people's faces were all of them shaking like no. And the look on her face when she realized what had actually happened and what she had done. And that was, you know, of course, she lost. And she started to cry and was upset. And I had to remove her from the room and take her outside, and ended up having to comfort her myself. Even though I'm broken up about it, you know, obviously at work, talking about things like that. That's like one of my saddest memories.
And I think it's hard because she didn't know.
Oh, yeah, exactly. Yeah, so
she didn't know. And then it probably scared her because, oh my gosh, could I lose my child? And it's just that awkwardness sometimes that comes with grief. But it would have been nice if, not that you want to be talked about in your work or in that gossip chain, but it would have been really nice if someone would have warned her. Hey, Matt's coming back to work. He took a leave because he lost his child. We just want to let you know. We know you're pregnant. We don't want either one of you to feel hurt inadvertently because you're not aware of it.
And later on throughout the day, as the gossip mill worked, I heard several people, you know, going, Jesus Christ, how did she not know? How did we not tell her? So, I mean, it was acknowledged that this was a big screw up on somebody's part, but I'm not sure, I mean, whose job was it, really, to tell? So, I mean, at one point, I think, like, when I had found out that, or not when I'd found out, I mean, when it happened, of course, you know, I had to notify my job and everything like that, and I gave my boss permission to tell people, but I didn't expect him to, you know, just to tell the people that were there, you know, the full-timers and stuff like that would get the information. Someone like her, you know, I didn't expect him to get on the phone and call her at home and tell her.
Right.
So, you know, there was nobody really at fault. It was just kind of a, like, wow, how did that happen situation. Yeah. That's one of those things I'll never forget, is when she surveyed the room, the faces on those people, especially this one guy who's always smiling, always joking. I'd never seen his face like that before.
Wow.
This completely, like, stern, like, nodding no, like he's not kidding. And just, his face looks sad. I've never seen his face look sad before.
Wow. Wow. Thank you for being so raw and honest in that story. And I know it's one that was difficult to share.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, losing your emotional cool in front of coworkers is, especially for a male, is not something that I wanted to do, and it's also something that's not really considered socially acceptable, and it's also something that should be okay, but something that I didn't ever want to do. I just wanted to sit in my cubicle and be a little worker bee, and everybody to leave me the hell alone.
Yeah. Yeah. And it had to be harder too with her pregnant. It just added another layer to it. So I feel like it places an added burden on a newly grieving parent. People are well-meaning, but if you're overcome with the grief, then go outward to someone to process it first. And then when you're with the parent that's grieving, it's okay to cry with them. I think they can even appreciate you crying with them. But there's a difference between crying with them and saying, I'm so sorry and this is so difficult, versus needing them almost to comfort you because you're so overcome with emotion. Does that make sense?
That is a much better way to put it.
Yeah, again, it's a loss like no other. And it kind of messes with our, what words do I want? The natural order of things. Like, we never think that we're going to outlive our children.
No, and you're right. It isn't the natural order of things. I can't even. There's at least one movie that comes to mind that there's just a quote that, no parent should outlive their children. That's just not the way it should work.
Right. And so it really can shake your belief structure, shake you to the core. I know for some parents that are grieving that they may even question their relationship with God. They may question their spirituality. They may be angry at God. Other people find deep comfort in their spiritual relationship with a higher being. But my understanding is, though, Matt, that you don't really have a spiritual practice, a religious practice. So if you wouldn't mind, can you share how that maybe impacted your grief?
Sure. I know it's, for a lot of people, it's unthinkable. But no, I don't believe in a God. I don't believe in any of that. And for people that do, I have absolutely, no issue with that. It's just my own personal beliefs. One thing, I guess I'm going into my therapy here and thinking about this, but the 5 stages or the stages of grief. One of them is bargaining. And if you don't believe in a higher power or a God or whatever, who are you bargaining with? So it's kind of, so when I, thought about those and went back to mine, I realized that I didn't have that stage. That was something that was completely omitted from my experience, because who was I going to bargain with? That's one thing to think about for those people who are not religious or without religion, that things that you may think of as normal, as far as your religious practices, think that those concepts, those ideas might be completely alien. And going on further to that, those people of other religions may not have the same tenets and beliefs that you do, so expecting them to, or making statements that just take that for granted, can be very hurtful to those that are grieving, adding undue aggravation and pressure to a situation that's already something that's way beyond something that most people can deal with psychologically in a normal manner anyway. So, no, I didn't have anybody to get angry with. I completely accepted the fact that it was an extremely unfortunate situation that happened. It didn't have anything to do with karma. It didn't have anything to do with me offending a deity. It didn't have anything to do with me paying comeuppance for some past transgression in another life or anything like that. So there isn't that blaming or regret because there wasn't anything that I did. This was something that even the physicians couldn't figure out what happened with her, even after performing a post-mortem examination. So, without that religious aspect, I think I looked on our loss, I guess, differently than a lot of people. I mean, I know there are a lot of non-religious people that experience loss, of course, and some of them, suddenly realize they're not so non-religious anymore, and others that were religious, walk away from their beliefs because it shakes the foundations of your belief system or how you understand the universe or how you understand your place in the world. And understandably so, because, like you said earlier, Michelle, it's not the natural order. So, rightly so, you would question things. And, I did ponder a lot of things. But again, I just came back to the same conclusion that, it didn't change my fact that I didn't think that there was a God. I didn't find God as a result of the loss. And in some ways, I think it made me work through my grief a little faster than some people in terms of getting to that point of acceptance of the loss. I didn't stop and ruminate on things that were, as far as I was concerned, irrelevant or beyond my control. Bargaining being the prime case of that as far as in the stages of grief. And just because I didn't have anybody to bargain with, it I wasn't angry, though. That was part of the grief that is something that took a very long time to work through because, anger doesn't necessarily have to be directed at any one thing. Because, to be honest, the loss of a child isn't fair. No matter how it happens, it's just not fair. And that's something to be angry about. And I think for men, anger is probably one of the bigger parts of going through the significant loss, the loss of a child.
I do think that anger is something that we all have to work through in a loss because it doesn't feel fair. And especially the loss of a child, it just isn't fair. Did you find if people made religious references that they were hurtful or offensive? I believe your partner had a really hard time if people would call your daughter an angel baby or you have an angel in heaven. And she does have a spiritual belief from my understanding, but she still found that very, very hurtful.
Yes, she did find that very hurtful. To explain it, I believe the best way to put it would be that you're praising some deity for killing her child.
That is really blunt, but yeah, that's the way that it can feel. And I've heard it said too that grieving parents don't want an angel in heaven. They want their baby in their arms. And they can struggle with, if it's a loving God, how can you want my child for your own? How can you take my child from me? Again, some people having an angel in heaven is incredibly comforting for them. But if you're supporting anyone or talking to someone that's lost a child, please, please follow their lead. If they call their child an angel baby in heaven, then absolutely do that. If they don't, then please refrain from saying that because it just can cut people to the quick.
Yes, it can make them, it can be a trigger. I mean, I know I experienced people with the best of intentions, and I didn't mean anything by it. But when they would say things like, oh, she's in a better place, or it was God's plan, those were the things that would immediately trigger the worst kind of anger in me. Because, again, I'm very much, when I'm dealing with people in person, I don't like to speak necessarily about religion. It's kind of one of those things you just don't talk about as far as I'm concerned. It's right up there with politics and how much money you make. It's just not something you bring about in polite conversation. It's one thing if you know the person from church or whatever else, or, you know that the person's an atheist or an agnostic or a humanist, whatever. But just to assume that a coworker believes the same as you and is going to take comfort from the fact that you're happy that their deity killed their child and they're up there with them now. That's, to me, if you break it down like that and think about that as an extremely insulting thing to say to somebody. I mean, I remember like one of the first times somebody made one of those religious platitudes. I think if looks could kill, she would have caught fire. I mean, I don't think I'd ever been that angry in my entire life. And it wasn't something I expected either. It was just something that hit me, and it was just, how dare you? And I think very quickly she realized the error of making that statement, because, I mean, I looked angry. It was one of those situations where I had to remove myself. And I don't think if that was the same subject, I don't think I would have gotten nearly as angry. And if it wasn't so raw, and bringing back to an earlier thing, we're expected to return to work like nothing happened after a couple of weeks. Now, it wouldn't make me nearly as angry as it did then. But I think people in general in our society are quite aware that people have different beliefs. But when it comes down to death, that all tends to fade away. You know, people are very PC about people's different beliefs and respecting that. But when it comes to death, a lot of that fades away and becomes very non-PC. Especially with, I guess you could say, the Christian majority, or the Christians in this country. I find a lot suddenly that people you may not have ever known were religious suddenly started throwing, religious things at you when it comes to death. And normally they would never speak about religion. And I think that's, I don't mean to say that we should make death PC, but I do think that you do need to take into account that your difference in beliefs can have a profound effect on somebody's grief, whether it causes anger or sadness, or increases sorrow, or it just compounds the burden that they're already carrying. Because you have to remember, people that are dealing with the loss of a child, are carrying a burden that most people won't ever understand, and shouldn't have to. Again, it's an unnatural thing. So I think people really should, before, to use a slightly religious quote, the road to hell was paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
And I think that applies.
Yeah, I agree. It's, it's so often well-meaning, but it's so important to really listen and reflect what the grieving person is saying. And if they aren't saying anything remotely spiritual or religious, then please simply refrain from those types of remarks. It can save a lot of hurt for everyone involved, probably.
You would think in a hospital setting, I mean, granted, the hospital we were in was for children and babies, so maybe death wasn't always quite as something that he dealt with. But I mean, he was a social worker,
right,
that worked in a hospital.
And it is a high-risk hospital.
And it is, it's specifically for, there are high-risk situations And
they deal with loss in that situation,
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And this guy comes into the room not too long after we found out that Rowan had passed, visibly unprepared, disorganized. I mean, his hands were shaking, and then proceeded to go over our options as far as what to do with her body once she was born. I think that is a prime example of even people who should be prepared for situations like that don't know how to react, and are unsure of how to react, to the point that, literally somebody who deals with death, works in a hospital, was visibly shaken. And unfortunately, it's, when you think about it that way, it's kind of profound, but at the time it was rather insulting. I mean, I remember almost wanting to chase him out of the room. Like, okay, I get that you have to do this. This is your job, but can you, be a little bit more professional about it, be a little bit more succinct, and just get out of our face. We realize that our child is dead, and that there's going to have to be, things, cremation, funeral, burial, what have you, all those other things that come with death. But I also thought his entrance into the situation was a little ill-timed as well, because it was still a rather new situation. It kind of seemed like it was okay, we got a, checklist here we've got to go through, so we've got to cross our I's and dot our T's, and we'll just do this as quickly as possible. So maybe the thought process being that you get it done out of the way sooner so we can just leave them the hell alone, or, again, maybe they just wanted to get it done and over with for themselves.
I do think there needs to be more training for nurses and social workers and even chaplains, because dealing with the loss of my daughter's grandma recently, some of the chaplains and the social workers were great, and some of them, it was just so awkward. And I don't know, but sometimes I think there's a great deal of skill that is involved in that, and bereavement training really needs to be, sensitivity training needs to be addressed.
I agree. And it's a difficult subject, and I think some people naturally have a knack for it, maybe more empathetic than other people, what they call highly sensitive people. And I think a lot of those people gravitate to this type of jobs, but I think others just find themselves in those jobs and, obviously aren't going to do as well as those who naturally have the ability to be more comforting to people that are, in dire emotional situations. But on that subject, though, of chaplains and stuff like that, I believe they send one in, and I think that's something else that should be addressed in a normal situation. I know in hospitals, a lot of times they do this without question or thought, probably, is to, when someone is dying or somebody just experienced, like we did, the death of our child, to send a chaplain in without asking us whether this person is non-denominational or just a spiritual advisor or something like that. But people who don't have the need for spiritual advisors, it's an undue burden that could possibly blow up in their face, because people are emotionally raw. And I remember at that point, I really didn't have a filter anymore. It was more of a, you're going to get whatever comes to mind, because I just don't have the mental capacity right now to be kind to people. So I think that's something that some people consider completely normal, wouldn't think about, and other people would find completely aggravating and anger-inducing and insulting, to be quite frank.
Yeah, I think it's important to ask families, is this something that you're interested in? Would you like to speak to the chaplain? Do you like any kind of spiritual support? Instead of just having them show up at the room, because it's not comforting for everyone. And even if you do have a religious practice or a spiritual practice, sometimes a stranger just can't bring that comfort for you unless they're really skilled. And it needs to be something that I think the family asks for. So since we're kind of on this topic, what did you find that was not helpful as you were working through the loss of your child?
Oh, wow. That's a big question. Sorry, I'm really having to think about that. The religious factor was, I think, an undue burden. I think, something that could easily have been left out, something I didn't have to deal with. And finding that so many of my coworkers and friends and acquaintances were finding that was the thing that they needed to say to me, I thought that was a rough thing to work through. The hardest thing was probably the societal expectation to get on with my life. And I don't mean get on with my life as in accept, I mean get on with my life as in forget it. It's something that's over and done with. You've had your time, now move on. And that I struggled with, because it's not something that you should forget, not something that you should put behind you in terms of, pretending like it never happened. Because I think that's profoundly unhealthy mentally. But also just perpetuates the situation that we're in when it deals with grieving. You don't talk about it. You comfort those who are not grieving. And basically you get isolated, And not that isolation's a bad thing. I mean, right after our loss, we intentionally isolated ourselves for a long time. Didn't really speak to many people, didn't go out of the house if we didn't absolutely need to. And pretty much I was the only one that left the house, usually just to go get fast food or something like that. And, back into the closed, shut-up house we went and didn't come out again.
Which is, you're saying that traditionally, hundreds of years ago, we honored their mourning more, and they wore somber colors, dark colors, and they were expected to stay at home, right?
Sitting Shiva, for one example.
Yeah. And I don't think we have really good grief practices any longer in our culture. So I think it's amazing that you intuitively just knew that you wanted to have that time to kind of cocoon yourselves and take that time that you needed to mourn and begin the process of working through the shock and beginning that journey of working through the grief. So as you did that, was there anything that was helpful?
I think in isolating ourselves, I think it allowed us to be just as emotionally raw as we needed to be. I think that was probably the best thing for us, because trying to hold things back and stifle your emotions is a daunting task. And the stronger the emotion, the harder it is. And I think bottling it up, like they say, is you're going to end up exploding. And that's not a situation that you need to have happen out in the world, because it can have, awful effects on work situation and relationships with others. I think that in a lot of cases, though, it's almost instinctual for humans to do that. And I'm going to use a kind of an analogy here, but you see an animal that gets hurt in the wild, one of their first things they're going to do is retreat into a burrow or someplace where they feel like they're comfortable or defended and surrounded and cocooned and safe. It's kind of the same thing with, at least how I experienced it with me, was I was emotionally very injured and I needed to remove myself from the world, the situation. I didn't want to be around anybody other than my partner. And again, so we could work through our grief and be just as sad and mournful and raw as we needed to be. Because I think you need to get that out of your system. You need to experience it as part, because you feel it. I mean, that's part of the process. Ignoring it, trying to stifle it, I don't think is healthy.
Amy Wright Glenn, who is a chaplain and a birth and bereavement doula, I was listening to a lecture she gave, and she said that the body knows how to mourn. And even when we're mourning, sometimes we can wail and make sounds. And if we would just listen to our bodies, and if people could give one another the space to do that, I think our grieving would go more smoothly. And I think it's wonderful that you are able to just honor your instincts and follow that. And for some people, they like to have loved ones close and other people close. But even in that, sometimes they just need that quiet time to
fall apart.
Yeah, exactly. And to cry and to not have to get up and not have to be social. And if they are with someone, it needs to be with someone that can just hold the space and let them be however they want to be. And they're not trying to fix it or mend it or treat the person like they're broken. Because I think that's something that happens with grief too, is we always want to fix it and make it better, or we can say that grieving person is broken. And all of that strong, raw emotion it's a part of the process of grief. And we need to allow that space for people to grieve instead of stifling it. But they're not broken. They're grieving. And if I can share one thing in supporting grieving people, is just to make peace with the fact that you can't fix it. There's nothing you can do to fix it. And as I'm saying that, I'm kind of teary because it's kind of a helpless feeling. So if you can just go into it knowing you can't fix it, but you can just be there to listen, maybe not even talk, just sit silently with that person. Give them the space when they're ready to express their thoughts or hold their hand.
Yes, and that's a very difficult thing for men. I had the same difficulties. I mean, my only solution for like an outside, beyond my partner and very, very close family and friends was a therapist to talk it out. And I highly recommend that for people, because even if you have a confidant or somebody you can speak to, having a person that is a stranger that you are not beholden to in any way and being able to unload on them is a very, very, very cathartic experience. Because if you think about it, having that confidant, that close friend that you can share things with, you're only going to share so much as to not offend that person.
It's true.
But with the therapist, you don't have to worry about offending them. That's their job. I mean, don't go in there and, curse them out or anything like that. But, I mean, in some cases, that might even be appropriate just to vent your anger. But, I mean, and having that person that is completely, a stranger to you, that you don't feel any need to save their emotions, I think is a wonderful thing. And I think that's something that people should consider at the very least. And I know it helped me profoundly having that sounding board, and a lot of the therapy, a lot of it was he sat there silently and listened. I would go on for 20 minutes about whatever subject and he wouldn't say a word. So, I mean, just having that ability to just have someone listen, that whether or not they're judging is, you don't care. This person, again, isn't a friend or a family member, is I think one of the most wonderful. Is like the title says, it's a very therapeutic experience.
And I agree. That person that can just hold space non-judgmentally and let you be so raw is invaluable.
I agree 100%.
So if there's any one thing that you could share, whether to a family that's just starting this journey of grief or to someone that knows someone that is, what would that be? One little pearl of, I wish I could have told people this.
Well, for one thing, know that you're not alone. And to be aware that your partner in this child loss, the father and the mother, be aware that your partner is going to change, as you're going to change as well. And to be mindful of that as far as dealing with the other person. Because it's much easier to see changes in other people than it is to see changes in yourself. But know that as much as that person may change, you're changing as well. So be cognizant of that. Not that you need to stop it, not that you need to halt it necessarily, but just be aware that this thing that you've experienced with this other person is going to change you permanently.
Yeah. That was very, very good. Full of wisdom. So thank you, Matt, for being here with us and sharing so openly with all of the listeners. I appreciate it more than I can ever say.
You're very welcome, Michelle. Sorry some of it's kind of rambly, but that's my process.
Oh, it's all good. It's a deep subject, and one I think that we need a moment to wrap our mind around our thoughts. If anyone is going through the loss of their child, please know that there are resources out there. There are support groups. There are therapists that specialize in child loss. And as Matt said, please know that you're not alone in this, because that grief can be so lonely and isolating. But 1 in 4 women has experienced some form of pregnancy or infant loss. So even with that statistic alone, there are others walking through their grief with you.
For more great conversations like these, or to find out more information and access Michelle's library of amazing guests, go to birtheaseservices.com/podcast. For more information on the Birthease method, Michelle's classes, meditations, and other services, go to birtheaseservices.com.